You know you should wake up early, eat better, and focus on what matters most. Yet you find yourself constantly breaking promises to yourself. Every morning you set intentions to be disciplined, only to watch yourself cave to distractions, procrastination, and impulses by afternoon, while others seem to effortlessly maintain the habits that lead to success. I am Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who maintained unshakable self-discipline while bearing the weight of the most powerful empire in history. For nearly 2 decades, I governed millions while developing the Stoic practices that became my personal philosophy of inner mastery. The principles of self-discipline I'll share will transform you into someone who follows through on commitments to yourself, using the same philosophy that sustained emperors through the greatest challenges. Whether you're ruling an empire or managing your daily routine, true power comes from mastering yourself first. But first, like this video, subscribe. For more Stoic wisdom, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for self-mastery has spread. I still remember the weight of the imperial seal ring when it was first placed on my finger. Not the physical weight, though the gold was substantial, but the crushing realization that every decision I made would now affect millions of lives across the known world. I was 39 years old, a philosopher by nature, thrust into absolute power when my adoptive father Antoninus Pius died unexpectedly. The purple robes felt foreign against my skin. Purple, the color reserved for emperors, dyed with the blood of thousands of murex shells. How fitting that the symbol of ultimate authority should be stained with sacrifice. But the real sacrifice, I quickly learned, was not in the shells that died for the dye. It was in the man who wore it. In those first months of rule, I discovered what unlimited power truly meant. I could have anything I desired with a mere gesture. The finest foods, the most beautiful companions, entertainment that would make gods envious. Senators competed to grant my every whim before I even voiced it. The temptation was not subtle. It was overwhelming, constant, seductive. I remember one particular evening when a feast was prepared in my honor. Tables groaned under delicacies from every corner of the empire. Peacock tongues from Gaul, spices from India, wines aged longer than most men lived. As I sat there, watching nobles compete for my attention with increasingly elaborate flattery, I felt something die inside me. Not my conscience, that remained intact, but my illusion that external power could bring internal satisfaction. That night, alone in my chambers, I made a decision that would define my reign. I took the imperial seal ring from my finger and held it up to the lamplight. The gold caught the flame, beautiful and cold. I realized then that this ring was not a symbol of what I could take. It was a symbol of what I must give. Every privilege it granted me was a responsibility I owed to Rome. From that moment, I understood that true discipline was not about restricting myself from pleasure. It was about choosing purpose over pleasure. The greatest emperors in our history were not those who indulged in every luxury, but those who used their power in service of something greater than themselves. I began developing what I would later call my morning discipline. Before dawn, while the palace slept, I would rise and spend time in reflection. I would remind myself that the purple robes were borrowed, that the power was temporary, but that the virtue with which I wielded both would echo through eternity. The imperial seal ring became my teacher. Each time I pressed it into wax to approve a law or decree, I asked myself, is this decision serving my ego or serving Rome? The weight of that question was far heavier than any gold ring. This was my first lesson in Stoic self-discipline. External. Power without internal discipline is not power at all. It is slavery to every impulse and desire that arises. The man who cannot govern himself cannot truly govern others. The emperor who lacks self-mastery will inevitably become a slave to his appetites, his fears, and his ego. I learned to see the purple not as a privilege, but as a practice ground for virtue. The first reports came from the eastern provinces like whispers of doom. A strange sickness, the physicians said. Unlike anything they had seen before, people would develop fever, then pustules, then death would follow within days. By the time we understood the gravity of the situation, what history would remember as the Antonine Plague had already begun its march toward Rome. I had been emperor for only a few years when this invisible enemy invaded my empire. No army could fight it, no diplomacy could negotiate with it, no wealth could buy immunity from it. It killed slaves and senators with equal indifference, respected no borders, and acknowledged no authority save its own deadly nature. When the plague reached Rome itself, panic spread faster than the disease. Citizens fled the city if they could afford to, while the poor huddled in their tenements, waiting for death or deliverance. My advisors urged me to retreat to one of the imperial villas in the countryside, away from the contaminated air of the Pura capital. Your life is too valuable to risk, they argued. Rome needs you alive. But that night, as I sat with the physician's reports spread before me, documents detailing thousands upon thousands of deaths, I faced the greatest test of discipline I had yet encountered. Not physical discipline, but emotional and moral. Discipline. Fear gnawed at my stomach like a living thing. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to save myself, to think of my own survival first. I remember holding one particular scroll, its parchment trembling in my hands. The numbers were staggering. Entire neighborhoods emptied, funeral pyres burning day and night, children orphaned faster than families could adopt them. The rational part of my mind calculated the odds of imperial survival if I remained in Rome. They were not encouraging, but then I asked myself the question that had become my guide. What would virtue demand of me now? Not comfort, not safety, not the preservation of my own life above all others. Virtue demanded presence, courage, the discipline to face uncertainty with grace. I chose to remain in Rome, not from reckless bravery, but from disciplined reasoning. If I fled, what message would that send to the people who could not flee? If their emperor abandoned them in their darkest hour, what hope could they maintain? My personal safety was less important than the collective morale of the empire. The plague taught me the most profound lesson about self-discipline. It is not about controlling external circumstances, for they are often beyond our control, but about controlling our response to those circumstances. I could not stop the disease, but I could stop my fear from making my decisions for me. Each morning, as I walked through the palace halls where servants worked with cloth over their faces, and physicians moved like ghosts between the sick and the healthy, I practiced what I would later write about extensively, the discipline of accepting what I could not change while focusing entirely on what I could change. I could not cure the plague, but I could ensure that grain shipments continued to flow to the affected areas. I could not prevent death, but I could prevent the empire from collapsing into chaos. I could not eliminate my own fear, but I could act courageously despite it. The discipline of that time was not about grand gestures or heroic moments. It was about showing up each day, reading the reports, making the necessary decisions, and maintaining hope when hope seemed foolish. It was about separating the facts from my feelings about the facts and responding to reality rather than to my fears about reality. When the plague finally subsided years later, I had learned something invaluable. External crises do not build character, they reveal it. The discipline we practice in peaceful times determines how we respond when everything falls apart. The Danube frontier was nothing like the marble halls of Rome. Here, where civilization met the wild Germanic tribes, philosophy had to prove itself against mud, blood, and the constant threat of death. I spent nearly a decade of my reign on these campaigns, and it was in a simple military tent by the light of oil lamps that I wrote the most honest words of my life. My portable writing desk was a humble thing, rough wood that could be broken down and reassembled as we moved from camp to camp. Yet it became my anchor, my refuge, my disciplinary practice. Each evening after the day's march or battle, while my generals planned the next day's strategy and soldiers tended their wounds, I would sit at that desk and write, not official dispatches or imperial decrees, but notes to myself, reminders, questions, struggles. What you know today as my meditations began as desperate attempts to maintain my sanity and virtue in the midst of war's chaos. The Germanic tribes were fierce warriors, unbound by Roman concepts of civilization or mercy. They fought with a savage intensity that initially shocked me. In my first major engagement against the Marcomanni, I watched Roman legionnaires, men I had trained and equipped, fall to barbarian axes and spears. The screams of dying horses, mixed with the cries of wounded men and the smell of blood, soaked into the earth. That night, alone in my tent, I felt something break inside me, not my resolve that remained intact, but my illusion that philosophy was merely an intellectual exercise. Here, faced with the brutal reality of leadership in war, I had to discover whether Stoic principles could survive when stakes were measured in human lives rather than academic debates. I wrote by lamplight, how much trouble he avoids who does. Not look to see what his neighbor says or does, but only to what he does himself. Easy words to write in a peaceful palace, but what did they mean when my neighbor was a Germanic chieftain trying to kill me and destroy everything I had sworn to protect? The discipline required for military campaign was unlike anything I had experienced. In Rome, my greatest challenge was resisting luxury and managing political intrigue. Here, I had to maintain moral clarity while ordering men to their deaths. I had to sleep in a tent while planning strategies that would create widows and orphans. I had to eat simple rations while carrying the weight of an empire's survival on my shoulders. Each battle tested not just my tactical skills, but my philosophical foundations. When I watched a young centurion die defending our supply lines, when I had to order the execution of deserters, when I received reports of villages burned and families scattered, these moments demanded a discipline deeper than any morning meditation. I learned to find stillness in the center of chaos. While battles raged around me, while arrows flew and men screamed, I discovered that the mind could remain clear and focused if properly trained. This was not the absence of fear. Fear served its purpose in keeping me alert, but the discipline to think clearly despite fear. My writing became more urgent during those years. Each entry was a conversation with myself about how to maintain virtue when virtue seemed like a luxury I could not afford. How do you remain just when justice might mean losing a war? How do you show mercy when mercy might endanger your soldiers? The Germanic wars taught me that external battles are just reflections of internal battles. Every enemy I faced across a battlefield was also a tendency I faced within myself. The desire for revenge, the temptation of cruelty, the seductive simplicity of hatred. Victory over external enemies meant nothing if I lost the war within my own soul. In that rough tent, writing by flickering lamplight while Germanic drums echoed across the dark forest, I discovered the true meaning of inner fortitude. It is not the absence of struggle, it is the presence of principle in the midst of struggle. It is choosing who you will be when everything you believe is being tested by fire and steel. The desk survived those campaigns, as did the discipline it helped me maintain. The hours before dawn have always belonged to me alone. While the palace slept, and even the earliest servants had not yet stirred, I would rise and begin what became the foundation of my entire approach to self-discipline. The morning practice that prepared my mind for whatever the day might bring kept a small bronze bell beside my bed, not to wake others, but to mark the sacred beginning of each day's philosophical work. The sound was gentle but insistent, cutting through the darkness like a call to spiritual arms. In those quiet moments, with only the flicker of an oil lamp for company, I learned that discipline is not built in grand gestures, but in small, consistent choices made when no one is watching. My morning routine was deceptively simple. I would sit in silence for a time, allowing my mind to settle from the fragments of dreams and the anticipation of the day's burdens. Then I would light the lamp and begin my contemplation, sometimes writing, sometimes simply thinking through the principles that would guide my actions. The first discipline was simply showing up. There were countless mornings when my body ached from the previous day's travels, when the weight of imperial decisions made my head throb, when the comfortable warmth of bed seemed infinitely preferable to the cold stone floor and the demanding work of self-examination. But I had learned something crucial. The moment we negotiate with our commitments to ourselves, we begin the slow erosion of character. I would begin each morning by acknowledging what the day would likely bring, not with dread or excitement, but with clear-eyed acceptance. Today I will meet interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness, I would remind myself. This was not pessimism, it was preparation. By acknowledging potential challenges before they arose, I could respond from principle rather than react from emotion. During those quiet hours, I developed what I called the discipline of grateful reflection. Before considering the day's problems, I would deliberately recall what was going well in the empire, which advisors had shown wisdom, what progress we had made toward justice and prosperity. This practice trained my mind to notice virtue and success as readily as it noticed problems and failures. The morning hours were also when I would examine my conscience from the previous day, not in self-flagellation, but in honest assessment. Where had I acted from ego rather than wisdom? When had I chosen the easy path over the right path? Which decisions had been driven by fear or desire rather than reason and virtue? This daily audit of my choices ensured that mistakes became lessons rather than repeated patterns. I discovered that the quality of my morning discipline directly influenced my effectiveness throughout the day. When I rushed through my reflection or skipped it entirely, I found myself reactive, impatient, and prone to decisions I would later regret. But when I gave adequate time to mental preparation, even the most challenging situations seemed manageable. The bell that marked the start of each morning practice became a symbol of something larger, the power we have to choose our response to life rather than simply react to it. Each ring was a reminder that while I could not control what happened to me, I could absolutely control what happened within me. These morning hours taught me that self-discipline is not about forcing yourself to do what you don't want to do. It's about training yourself to want what leads to flourishing. Through consistent practice, I came to crave these quiet moments of reflection. As much as others craved rich food or fine wine, the true art of morning discipline lies not in any particular practice, but in the commitment to meet yourself honestly, each day before you meet the world. It is in these private moments that public virtue is forged. The golden chalices arrived from across the empire, masterpieces of craftsmanship that could buy a villa or feed a village for months. Yet I found myself drinking from a simple wooden cup, rough-hewn and unremarkable, that I had commissioned from a local carpenter. This choice puzzled my courtiers and irritated my advisors, but it represented the most important lesson I learned about the nature of desire. Happiness comes not from getting what you want, but from wanting what you have. As emperor, I could have anything, anything. The finest silks from China, the most exquisite foods from every corner of the known world, entertainment that would make the gods envious. Palace servants competed to anticipate my every wish before I voiced it. The sheer availability of pleasure became its own form of prison. I remember a particular feast early in my reign where the excess reached absurd proportions. Tables groaned under delicacies that had traveled thousands of miles, flamingo tongues from Africa, honey cakes sweetened with pearls, wines aged longer than most senators had lived. Musicians played, while dancers performed, and the air itself seemed thick with luxury and indulgence. Midway through the evening, as I watched nobles gorge themselves on rarities while discussing which new pleasure to pursue next, I felt a profound emptiness. Here was everything a man could desire, yet no one seemed truly satisfied. Each delicacy consumed led only to craving for the next. Each entertainment witnessed created demand for something more elaborate. The pursuit of pleasure had become an insatiable hunger that fed on itself. That night I began experimenting with what I would later understand as the discipline of desire. Instead of the golden cup presented to me, I asked for the simplest vessel available, a clay cup used by kitchen servants. The wine tasted exactly the same, yet something profound shifted in my perception. By choosing simplicity over luxury, I had chosen freedom over slavery. The wooden cup became my teacher. Each time I drank from it, I reminded myself that the emperor who needed golden vessels to enjoy his wine was a slave to gold. The man who could find satisfaction in simple things was truly free. This was not deprivation. It was liberation from the tyranny of endless wanting. I discovered that desire operates by a cruel logic. The more we have, the more we need to feel satisfied. The rich man who requires increasingly expensive wines to feel pleasure is poorer than the simple man who delights in water from a clear spring. Abundance, I learned, was not about accumulating more, but about needing less. This understanding transformed how I approached every aspect of imperial life. When presented with elaborate new robes, I would ask, do these serve their function better than simpler garments? When offered exotic foods, I would consider, will this nourish my body more effectively than basic fare? When tempted by new entertainments, I would reflect, will this improve my character or merely distract from more important pursuits? The discipline of desire required constant vigilance. Desire is clever. It disguises itself as need, justifies itself through reason, and promises happiness it cannot deliver. I learned to recognize its voice and question its claims. When I felt the pull toward some new acquisition or experience, I would pause and ask, am I choosing this because it will genuinely improve my life, or because I've confused wanting with needing? The most profound realization came when I understood that contentment is a choice, not a circumstance. External conditions change constantly. Sometimes we have more, sometimes less, sometimes comfort, sometimes hardship. But the capacity to find satisfaction in present reality is a skill that can be developed through practice. I trained myself to notice and appreciate what was already present, rather than focusing on what was absent. The warmth of sunlight, the loyalty of true friends, the satisfaction of work well done, the simple pleasure of clear thinking. These were available regardless of external circumstances. The wooden cup taught me that true wealth lies not in having everything you want, but in wanting nothing you do not have. The scroll before me contained a death sentence. A provincial governor had been embezzling funds intended for orphan care. Money that should have fed and housed children was lining his private coffers while they suffered in squalor. The evidence was overwhelming, the crime clear, the prescribed punishment unambiguous. Yet, as I held my stylus above the parchment that would order his execution, I faced one of the most challenging aspects of self-discipline, the discipline of right action when right action is difficult. Every fiber of my being wanted to show mercy. The governor had been a friend, a man I had appointed personally, someone whose family I knew and whose children played with mine. His wife had sent tearful letters begging for clemency, reminding me of past favors and shared memories. The easy path, the comfortable path, would be to commute his sentence, perhaps to exile or public censure. But as I sat there, stylus trembling in my hand, I remembered my commitment to justice over comfort. The orphans who had suffered because of his greed would receive no mercy from hunger or cold. The precedent I set would echo through every province of the empire. If the emperor's friends could steal from the most vulnerable without facing consequences, what message would that send about the value of justice versus the value of personal relationships? I signed the death warrant. The stylus felt heavy as lead, and my heart grieved, but my conscience remained clear. This was the discipline of action, doing what virtue demands, even when it tears at your soul. The discipline of action differs fundamentally from the discipline of desire or thought. With desire, we wrestle with internal cravings. With thought, we work to control our judgments and perceptions. But with action, we must translate principle into practice, often in situations where there are no perfect choices, only necessary ones. I learned that right action often feels wrong in the moment. When I chose to remain in Rome during the plague, rather than flee to safety, every instinct screamed that I was being foolish. When I insisted on fair trials for captured Germanic chieftains who had killed Roman citizens, many called me weak. When I allocated imperial funds to care for gladiators' widows instead of building monuments to my reign, advisors questioned my priorities. The key to the discipline of action lies in having a clear framework for decision-making before emotions and pressures cloud judgment. I developed what I called my decision scroll, a mental template I would apply to difficult choices. First, what would perfect virtue do in the situation? Second, what would serve the common good rather than my personal interests? Third, what decision could I defend to my conscience on my deathbed? This framework prevented me from being paralyzed by the complexity of imperial decisions. When senators pressured me to approve popular but unjust laws, when generals urged swift but brutal military responses, when citizens demanded privileges that would harm the empire's long-term stability, in all these situations, I could return to my core questions and find clarity amidst confusion. The discipline of action also required accepting the loneliness of leadership. The right choice is often the unpopular choice. The virtuous decision frequently makes enemies, while the expedient decision makes friends. I learned that if my goal was to be liked, I would fail as both emperor and human being. If my goal was to act with virtue, I might be respected even by those who disagreed with my decisions. Perhaps the most difficult aspect of action discipline was learning to accept the consequences of right choices without regret. When the governor was executed, his family suffered. When I maintained strict military discipline, good soldiers died following orders they might have questioned. When I enforced justice, equally regardless of social status, powerful people became my enemies. I had to train myself to separate the rightness of the action from the pain of its consequences. A surgeon's knife causes pain, but healing requires the cutting. A just law creates hardship for those who profit from injustice, but society requires the enforcement. A leader's difficult decision may bring suffering to some, but leadership requires the choosing. The discipline of action taught me that virtue is not a passive philosophical concept. It is an active force that demands courage, wisdom, and the willingness to pay the price for doing what is right. The messenger burst into my private chambers with news that would have shattered a lesser man's composure. Barbarian tribes had crossed the Danube in unprecedented numbers, 3. Legions were under siege, and reports suggested the largest Germanic uprising in decades. My first impulse was panic, a flooding sensation of dread that made my chest tight, and my thoughts raced toward catastrophe. But I had learned something crucial during my years of philosophical practice: the difference between what happens and what I think about what happens. The barbarian crossing was a fact. My terror about potential consequences was an interpretation, and I had complete control over which interpretation I chose to accept. I kept a polished bronze mirror in my study, not for vanity, but for a practice I called examining assent. When overwhelming news arrived, whether military defeats, political betrayals, or personal losses, I would look into that mirror and watch my own face as the initial emotions played across it. Fear, anger, disappointment, excitement, all were visible in my expressions. But then I would ask myself, what am I adding to the bare facts that is not actually present in reality? The discipline of assent is perhaps the most subtle but powerful of all Stoic practices. It recognizes that between any event and our response to it lies a crucial moment of interpretation, a split second, where we decide what the event means. Most people rush through this moment unconsciously, allowing their first emotional reaction to become their reality. But with practice, this moment can be stretched, examined, and controlled. When the messenger delivered his frightening news, the bare facts were simple. Germanic tribes had crossed a river and engaged Roman forces, but my mind immediately began adding interpretations. This means we're doomed. I'm a failed emperor. The empire will fall under my watch. My legacy will be destruction. None of these interpretations were present in the messenger's actual words. They were stories I was telling myself about what the facts might mean. The mirror showed me my own fear, and I used that reflection to practice what I came to call fact separation. I would deliberately distinguish between what was actually happening and what I imagined might happen. The tribal crossing was real. My catastrophic predictions were imagination. The siege was factual. My assumption that it would end in defeat was speculation. This practice transformed how I handled every challenging situation. When senators criticized my policies, I learned to separate their actual words from my interpretation of those words. When citizens protested my decisions, I distinguished between their actions and my assumptions about their motivations. When my own body showed signs of aging and illness, I separated physical sensations from my fears about what they might portend. The discipline of assent requires constant vigilance because the mind's habit is to blur facts with interpretations until they become indistinguishable. We say, "I am insulted," when we should say, "Someone spoke words that I am interpreting as insulting." We declare, "This is terrible," when we should observe, "This is happening, and I am judging it as terrible." The difference is not semantic. It is the difference between being controlled by events and choosing our response to events. I developed specific techniques for maintaining this discipline under pressure. When receiving disturbing news, I would pause and ask, what exactly did I hear? What am I adding to what I heard? Which parts are facts and which are my judgments about those facts? This simple practice prevented countless poor decisions driven by emotional reactions to imaginary problems. The bronze mirror became my teacher in objectivity. It showed me that my facial expressions often reflected my interpretations than reality itself. When I learned to control my assent to initial impressions, my face remained calm even in crisis, which in turn helped my advisors think more clearly and make better decisions. The most profound realization came when I understood that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. The Germanic uprising, when met with clear thinking rather than panicked interpretation, proved manageable through strategic response. Most of our torment comes not from what actually happens, but from the meanings we assign to what happens. The discipline of assent taught me that while I cannot control events, I have absolute sovereignty over the court of my own mind, where I decide what testimony to accept and what verdicts to render about reality. The senator's words cut through the chamber like a blade. Your policies have weakened Rome, your philosophy has made you soft, and your leadership will be remembered as the beginning of our empire's decline. The accusation was not only false but deliberately crafted to provoke me in front of the entire Senate. I felt heat rise in my chest, my jaw clench, and my hands form fists beneath my toga. Every instinct screamed for retaliation, but instead of responding immediately, I reached for the small, smooth stone I always carried in my pocket. My fingers closed around its familiar coolness, and in that simple touch, I found the pause I needed to prevent a moment of anger from becoming a lifetime of regret. Anger had been my greatest enemy long before any barbarian tribe threatened our borders. In my youth, I possessed a fierce temper that could flare without warning, a dangerous liability for someone destined to wield absolute power. I learned early that an angry emperor was a tyrant in waiting, and that the discipline of emotional control was not optional for effective leadership. The cooling stone became my anchor in moments of rage. Its smooth surface, worn by countless touches, reminded me that anger is like fire, useful when controlled, destructive when unleashed without purpose. When senators attacked my character, when generals questioned my military decisions, when citizens blamed me for circumstances beyond any mortal's control, that stone gave me the crucial seconds needed to choose my response rather than react from impulse. I discovered that anger always begins with a thought. This should not be happening. Whether facing political opposition, military setbacks, or personal betrayals, my anger invariably stemmed from the belief that reality should conform to my preferences rather than following its own course. The senator's insult angered me, not because of the words themselves, but because I believed he should not have spoken them. But what if I accepted that senators sometimes speak foolishly? What if I recognized that criticism, even unfair criticism, was simply part of the reality of leadership? What if I expected rather than resented the political attacks that came with imperial power? When I shifted my expectations to align with reality rather than demanding that reality align with my preferences, anger lost its grip on me. I developed what I call the anger audit, a practice of examining my fury to understand its true source. When the cooling stone was in my hand, I would ask myself, what expectation is being violated here? What demand am I making of reality that reality is refusing to meet? How is my anger serving me or others in this moment? The answers were always revealing. My anger at military defeat stemmed from my expectation that virtue should guarantee victory. My fury at political opposition came from my demand that reasonable policies should face no resistance. My rage at personal criticism arose from my belief that good intentions should be immune from attack. Each time I examined anger this way, I found the same pattern. I was not angry at what was happening, but at the gap between what was happening and what I thought should be happening. Once I saw this clearly, I could choose to close that gap by changing my expectations rather than changing reality. The stone taught me that emotional discipline is not about suppressing feelings, but about understanding them. Anger contains information. It tells us when our expectations are unrealistic, when our ego is threatened, when we are trying to control what cannot be controlled. But this information is only useful if we can access it without being overwhelmed by the emotion itself. I learned to welcome anger as a teacher rather than resist it as an enemy. When fury arose, I would think, here is my instructor arriving to show me where I am still attached to outcomes beyond my control. This reframe transformed anger from a destructive force into a diagnostic tool for identifying areas where my thinking needed adjustment. The cooling stone remained my companion. Through decades of rule, its surface growing even smoother with use. It reminded me that the emperor who could not master his own emotions had no business attempting to master an empire, and that true strength lay not in the expression of anger, but in the wisdom to choose when anger served justice and when it served only ego. The hourglass sat on my desk like a silent oracle, its sand falling grain by grain in perfect indifference to my imperial concerns. Each particle that dropped from the upper chamber to the lower was a moment of my life that would never return, a heartbeat closer to the end that awaits every mortal, emperor, and slave alike. This simple device became my most profound teacher about the most precious resource any human possesses, time. I was 47 when I first truly understood that I was going to die. Not in the abstract way that all men acknowledge mortality, but in the visceral, undeniable way that changes how you see each passing hour. A brief illness had confined me to bed for several days, and during those long hours of fever and weakness, I felt time moving through me like water through cupped hands. I emerged from that sickness with a clarity that transformed my entire approach to living. The hourglass reminded me daily that life is not a dress rehearsal. Every moment spent on trivial concerns, every hour wasted on meaningless distractions, every day lost to activities that neither served virtue nor brought genuine fulfillment. These were gone forever, leaving nothing behind but regret. The emperor who squandered time was poorer than the beggar who used his wisely. I began conducting what I called mortality meditations, daily reflections on the brevity of life and the urgency this should create for meaningful action. I would ask myself, if I had only 1 year to live, would I spend today as I am planning to spend it? If this were my final week as emperor, would these concerns deserve my attention? If I died tonight, would I be satisfied with how I used the hours I was given today? These were not morbid thoughts, but liberating ones. Awareness of death's certainty and timing's uncertainty cut through the fog of trivial anxieties that had previously consumed my mental energy. Political rivalries that had seemed monumentally important suddenly appeared petty when viewed from the perspective of the grave. Personal slights that had rankled for months dissolved when measured against the shortness of life. The discipline of time required brutal honesty about how I was actually spending my days versus how I claimed to value my time. I discovered a shocking gap between my stated priorities and my actual schedule. I said I valued family relationships, yet I often worked late into the evening on matters that could wait. I claimed to prioritize justice and virtue, yet I spent hours on ceremonial obligations that served only my ego. I instituted what I called the deathbed test for all my activities. Before committing to any meeting, project, or obligation, I would imagine myself on my final day and ask, will I be glad I spent precious hours of my finite life on this? The answer eliminated an astonishing amount of busy work that had masqueraded as important responsibility. The hourglass taught me that time's scarcity makes it valuable, but time's irreversibility makes it sacred. Money can be earned again, relationships can be repaired, mistakes can be corrected, but time, once spent, is gone forever. This realization transformed procrastination from a minor weakness into a major moral failing. To delay important action was to steal from my future self and squander the gift of present opportunity. I learned to treat each day as both precious and limited. Precious because of the good it might contain, limited because it would never come again. This perspective created urgency without panic, focus without rigidity. I became fiercely protective of my time while remaining generous with my attention for what truly mattered. The falling sand reminded me that the only moment I truly possessed was this one. The past existed only in memory, the future only in imagination. But this moment, this grain of sand falling right now, was real and mine to use wisely or waste foolishly. The discipline of time was ultimately the discipline of presence, being fully here, fully now, fully engaged with what deserved my irreplaceable life force. The iron weights were crude things, simple bars and stones that could be packed and transported as we moved from one military camp to another. While my soldiers maintained their fitness through marching and combat training, I maintained mine through a daily ritual that many found peculiar. An emperor lifting heavy objects like a common laborer. But I had discovered something that escaped most observers: the profound connection between physical discipline and mental strength. Each morning, before the philosophical reflection and after the initial waking, I would spend time training my body. Not for vanity or competition, but because I had learned that the mind and body were not separate entities, but different aspects of the same whole. The discipline required to lift heavy weight when my muscles ached was identical to the discipline required to make difficult decisions when my heart ached. Remember a particularly challenging period during the Germanic campaigns when morale was low, supplies were dwindling, and reports from Rome brought news of plague and political unrest. The easy path would have been to lie in my tent, consumed by worry and planning. Instead, I forced myself to perform my physical exercises with even greater intensity. As I lifted those iron weights, feeling my muscles strain against resistance, I felt my mental resolve strengthen in parallel. The weights taught me that strength is not a finite resource, but a renewable one. The more you use it properly, the more you develop. When I avoided physical challenge, my body grew weak, and so did my willpower. When I embraced physical difficulty, my body grew strong, and my capacity to handle other difficulties expanded accordingly. Physical discipline served as a daily metaphor for all other forms of self-mastery. When I didn't want to exercise but did it anyway, I was practicing the same skill needed to choose virtue over comfort in any situation. When I pushed through the discomfort of tired muscles, I was building the same resilience needed to persist through political opposition or personal setbacks. I discovered that the body is an excellent teacher of truth because it cannot be fooled by words or concepts. Muscles either grow stronger or weaker based on how they are used, regardless of what we tell ourselves about our intentions. Hearts either become more efficient or less efficient based on how they are challenged, regardless of our excuses about time or circumstances. The body's honest feedback helped me develop similar honesty about other areas of my life. The simple act of maintaining physical fitness while governing an empire taught me about priorities and time management. There was always something more urgent than exercise, battles to plan, dispatches to review, audiences to grant. But I learned that if I waited for a convenient time to care for my body, that time would never come. The same principle applied to caring for my mind, my relationships, and my character. Physical training also provided crucial stress relief during the most demanding periods of rule. When political pressures mounted or military crises demanded constant attention, the simple act of moving my body and challenging my muscles created a reset for my nervous system. The endorphins released through physical exertion helped clear my thinking and restore emotional equilibrium. I began to see my body not as a vessel for my mind, but as a partner in the work of living virtuously. A weak, neglected body created distractions and limitations that hindered clear thinking. A strong, well-maintained body provided energy and resilience that supported wisdom and courage. The iron weights became symbols of a larger truth. In every area of life, we either grow stronger through appropriate challenge or grow weaker through avoidance of difficulty. The emperor who pampered his body was training himself to pamper his character. The leader who avoided physical discomfort was practicing avoidance of moral discomfort. Most importantly, I learned that physical discipline was never really about the body. It was about the will. Each repetition was an act of choosing difficulty over ease, effort over comfort, growth over stagnation. These choices, made consistently over time, shaped not just my physical strength, but my character itself. The senator who had opposed every policy I proposed for 3 years was dying. His family had requested an audience, not for political purposes, but so he could speak with me before his death. As I sat beside his bed, listening to his labored breathing, I faced one of the most challenging aspects of self-discipline: maintaining virtue in relationships with people who had treated me as an enemy. I kept what I called my friendship tablet, a collection of personal notes about maintaining virtuous relationships despite the corrupting pressures of political power. On it, I had written reminders that would guide me through the complex web of human interactions that defined imperial life. Remember that you cannot control how others treat you, but you have complete control over how you treat others. The dying senator had been particularly cruel in his opposition. He had questioned my competence publicly, spread rumors about my philosophical pursuits, making me weak, and consistently voted against measures I believed would benefit Rome. His criticism had stung because some of it contained uncomfortable grains of truth wrapped in malicious intent. Yet, as I watched him struggle for breath, I felt only compassion for a fellow human being facing the ultimate transition. This moment crystallized something I had been learning gradually. The discipline of relationships requires separating people from their behaviors and both from our reactions to them. The senator's opposition to my policies was a fact. His sometimes personal attacks were facts. But my interpretation of these facts, whether I saw them as betrayals, insults, or simply the natural friction of political life, was entirely my choice. I had learned to ask myself crucial questions about every difficult relationship. What would perfect virtue look like in this interaction? How can I respond in a way that honors the best in both of us? What behavior from me would I be proud to remember on my deathbed? These questions prevented me from being dragged into the petty retaliation and political games that consume so many relationships in the imperial court. The discipline of relationships was particularly challenging because it required maintaining virtue even when others abandoned it. When senators flattered me to my face while plotting against me behind closed doors, I had to choose between reciprocal deception and honest engagement. When generals praised my decisions publicly but criticized them privately to their troops, I could respond with similar duplicity or with consistent authenticity. I discovered that most relationship problems stemmed from trying to control how others thought, felt, or acted toward me. When I expected gratitude and received criticism, when I offered friendship and received suspicion, when I demonstrated mercy and was accused of weakness, these disappointments arose from my attempts to control outcomes beyond my influence. Aviam. Friendship Tablet reminded me that the only person in any relationship whose behavior I could control was myself. I could not make the senator appreciate my policies, but I could implement them fairly regardless of his opposition. I could not force my advisors to speak honestly to me, but I could create an environment where honesty was rewarded over flattery. I could not guarantee that my generosity would be reciprocated, but I could be generous anyway, because generosity served virtue regardless of its reception. One of my most important discoveries was that relationships flourish when we focus on what we can give rather than what we can get. When I approached interactions with senators, generals, family members, or citizens by asking, "How can I serve the best interests of this person and our shared community?" rather than, "What can this person do for me?" the quality of those relationships improved dramatically. The dying senator's final words to me were unexpected. "You have been a better emperor than I gave you credit for, and a better man than I deserved." I realized then that maintaining virtue in difficult relationships was not just about personal integrity. It was about creating space for others to find their own virtue, even when that discovery came late. The discipline of relationships taught me that love is not primarily a feeling but a practice, the practice of consistently choosing the welfare of others and the health of our shared community, regardless of how others choose to treat us in return. The small bronze coin I carried bore the image of a skull surrounded by the words "Memento Mori," remember, you must die. Most people would find such a reminder morbid, but I discovered it was the most liberating practice I could develop. By contemplating death daily, not with fear but with acceptance, I learned to live with unprecedented clarity and purpose. Coin came to me during my early years as emperor, a gift from my philosophy teacher who understood that power's greatest danger was not corruption, but the illusion of permanence. Death is the great equalizer, he told me as he placed it in my palm. The emperor who remembers his mortality will rule more wisely than the one who forgets it. I began each day by holding that coin and reflecting on the simple truth it represented. This could be my last day alive, not as a source of anxiety, but as a clarifying principle. If this were truly my final 24 hours, what would deserve my attention? What petty concerns would lose their power over me? What relationships would demand my immediate care? What legacy would I want to leave through today's actions? The practice of contemplating death taught me that most of our fears are phantoms. We fear death, yet death is simply the natural conclusion to life, as natural as winter following autumn. As night following day, we fear the unknown, yet death is the most certain fact about human existence. We fear loss, yet everything we possess was temporary from the moment we received it. During the Germanic campaigns, death surrounded me constantly. Young soldiers who had laughed around campfires in the evening lay still in the morning, brave. Centurions who had served the empire faithfully for decades fell to barbarian spears in random moments of battle. Each loss reminded me that death comes not when we are ready for it, but when it chooses to arrive. I learned to see these deaths not as tragedies, but as teachings. Each fallen soldier demonstrated the urgency of living virtuously while we have the chance. Each friend whose life ended unexpectedly reminded me that tomorrow was promised to no one, emperor or commoner alike. Each encounter with mortality stripped away the illusion that I had unlimited time to become the person I intended to be. The coin taught me to distinguish between what death could take from me and what it could not. Death could take my body, my possessions, my earthly power, my relationships with others, but it could not touch what I had built in my character. The virtue I developed, the wisdom I gained, the love I had given and received, the positive impact I had made on others, these were beyond death's reach because they existed in the eternal realm of what had already happened. This understanding transformed how I approached every day. Instead of hoarding time or avoiding difficult conversations because they might be uncomfortable, I spent my hours as if they were coins from a purse that would soon be empty. Instead of postponing expressions of love or gratitude until a more convenient moment, I offered them immediately because convenience might never come. The discipline of facing death required releasing attachment to outcomes beyond my control while maintaining complete commitment to actions within my influence. I could not control whether I would live to see Rome's next victory or whether my policies would survive my successors, but I could control whether today's decisions reflected my deepest values and highest aspirations. Most profoundly, contemplating death taught me that dying well required learning to live well. The emperor who spent his days in virtue would face his final day with peace. The leader who used his power in service of justice would meet death as a friend rather than an enemy. The man who had given his best to each moment would have no regrets when moments ended. The memento mori coin reminded me that death was not the opposite of life, but its completion, and that a life lived with awareness of mortality was infinitely richer than one lived in denial of it. On my desk sat a small bronze model of a fortress, not any particular stronghold, but the ideal of an impregnable citadel with walls so high and foundations so deep that no external force could breach them. This miniature fortress represented the ultimate goal of all Stoic discipline, the creation of an inner citadel, so well defended that no circumstance, no matter how challenging, could disturb the peace within. I had learned through years of practice that external events, whether victories or defeats, praise or criticism, health or illness, possessed only the power I granted them over my inner state. The fortress model reminded me daily that true freedom lay not in controlling my circumstances, but in building an unconquerable sanctuary within my own mind, where virtue reigned supreme, regardless of what chaos surrounded it. The concept of the inner citadel emerged from my darkest periods as emperor. During the plague years, when death stalked every street in Rome and my advisors pressured me to flee to safety, I discovered that I could find perfect tranquility at the center of perfect storm. While the world outside churned with fear and uncertainty, something essential within me remained untouchable, unshakable, free. This inner fortress was not built through wishful thinking or philosophical theory, but through disciplined practice repeated thousands of times. Each morning when I chose reflection over comfort, each moment when I selected virtue over convenience, each decision when I picked principle over popularity, these choices laid stones in the walls of my inner citadel until it became impregnable. The fortress taught me that self-mastery has specific architecture. The outer walls were built from the discipline of desire, the ability to find contentment regardless of external circumstances. The inner walls rose from the discipline of aversion, the capacity to remain calm when facing what I preferred to avoid. The keep at the center was constructed from the discipline of action, the commitment to virtue regardless of consequences. I learned that attacks on this inner citadel came in predictable patterns. Fear would assault the gates, trying to convince me that future disasters were inevitable. Anger would storm the walls, demanding that I retaliate against perceived injustices. Grief would undermine the foundations, insisting that losses were unbearable. But a well-built inner fortress could withstand any siege because it drew its strength from sources that external circumstances could not touch. The most profound realization came when I understood that the inner citadel was not a place of isolation, but of connection. From within its walls, I could engage with the world more fully, because I was no longer at the mercy of my reactions to the world. I could love more deeply because I was not dependent on being loved in return. I could serve more effectively because I was not distracted by concerns about recognition or reward. This fortress of the mind became my true home. Whether I was in the marble halls of Rome or the muddy trenches of the Germanic frontier, whether surrounded by loyal friends or dangerous enemies, whether enjoying robust health or fighting illness, my real residence was this inner space where I could always find peace, clarity, and purpose. The bronze model showed me that freedom was not about having unlimited choices, but about having an unconquerable core from which to make choices. The emperor who needed everything to go his way was a slave to circumstances. The man who could maintain his essential self, regardless of what happened around him, was truly free. Building the inner citadel required accepting a paradox. The more I released my grip on external outcomes, the more effective I became at influencing them. When I stopped needing specific results from my actions, I could focus entirely on ensuring that my actions reflected my highest values. When I ceased demanding that others behave in particular ways, I could respond to their actual behavior with wisdom rather than frustration. The ultimate fruit of the inner citadel was not indifference to the world, but engagement with it from a place of strength rather than need. From within this fortress of self-mastery, I could give myself fully to the work of leadership, knowing that my peace and purpose did not depend on the results of that work, but on the integrity with which I performed it. The small oil lamp flickered. In the darkness of my private chamber, its steady flame my only companion during the hours I reserved for solitary contemplation. While the palace slept and even the guards dozed at their posts, I would sit alone with my thoughts, examining my conscience and preparing my soul for the challenges of public life. This simple practice taught me that true discipline must be cultivated in solitude before it can flourish in community. The lamp burned the same oil used throughout the palace, yet in these private moments it seemed to give off a different quality of light, not the harsh illumination needed for reading documents or conducting audiences, but the gentle radiance that made honest self-reflection possible. Without this daily retreat into solitude, I discovered my public effectiveness diminished rapidly under the pressures of constant decision-making and interpersonal demands. I learned that solitude and community were not opposites, but partners in the development of character. The discipline I practiced alone, controlling my thoughts, examining my motives, aligning my actions with my values, created the foundation for authentic leadership in public settings. Without the private work of self-mastery, My public persona became a performance rather than an expression of genuine virtue. The hermit's lamp reminded me that every leader needs a cave, a space removed from the demands and distractions of public life where the essential work of character development could occur without interruption. In these solitary hours I was neither emperor nor philosopher, neither judge nor general, but simply a human being wrestling with the fundamental questions of how to live well and serve others effectively. During my evening solitude, I would review the day's interactions with brutal honesty. When had I spoken from ego rather than wisdom? Which decisions had been driven by the desire to be liked rather than the commitment to be just? Where had I allowed the pressures of leadership to compromise my principles? This daily audit could only happen in private, away from the eyes and expectations of others. But I also discovered that solitude without community becomes self-indulgence, just as community without solitude becomes performance. The insights gained during my private contemplation needed to be tested and applied in the complex arena of human relationships. The peace I found in solitary reflection had to be strong enough to survive the chaos of Senate meetings, military councils, and diplomatic negotiations. The lamp taught me to see solitude not as escape from responsibility, but as preparation for it. The emperor, who could not bear to be alone with his own thoughts, was not fit to bear the weight of others' welfare. The leader who needed constant validation and stimulation lacked the inner resources necessary for making difficult decisions that might be unpopular but were nonetheless right. I began to understand that authentic leadership required what I called integrated discipline, the seamless connection between private character and public action. The virtue practiced in solitude had to be the same virtue expressed in community. The principles that guided my evening contemplation had to be the principles that shaped my daily governance. The most profound discovery was that the stronger my solitary practice became, the more present and engaged I could be with others. When I was grounded in my own center, I could listen more deeply to advisors, respond more thoughtfully to criticism, and serve more effectively the needs of the empire. The time spent alone was not time taken away from others, but time invested in my capacity to serve them well. The hermit's lamp became a symbol of the balance every leader must maintain between inner work and outer service. It reminded me that the public figure who neglected private reflection would eventually have nothing authentic to offer the community, while the private contemplative who avoided public engagement would fail to fulfill his obligations to the larger human family. In the gentle light of that lamp, I learned that true discipline creates not separation from others, but deeper connection. The connection that comes from engaging with the world from a place of genuine strength rather than hidden need. The bronze stylus I used for my most important writings was worn smooth by countless hours of recording lessons, not grand proclamations or imperial decrees, but simple observations about how to cultivate virtue in oneself and inspire it in others. I had learned that teaching discipline was far more complex than practicing it alone, requiring a delicate balance between guidance and freedom, example and instruction, patience and firmness. My first attempts at teaching discipline were disasters of good intention. When I saw senators making decisions based on personal gain rather than public good, I would lecture them about Stoic principles. When generals prioritized glory over strategy, I would explain the importance of ego discipline. When citizens complained about policies designed for long-term benefit, I would preach about the need for broader perspective. The result was polite nodding, followed by unchanged behavior. I slowly realized that discipline cannot be imposed from the outside. It must be chosen from within. My role as a leader was not to force others to be disciplined, but to create conditions where discipline could flourish and to model what disciplined living looked like in practice. The stylus became my tool for recording these more subtle approaches to inspiring virtue in others. The breakthrough came when I stopped trying to teach discipline through words and began demonstrating it through actions. When senators saw me consistently choosing justice over popularity, some began questioning their own motivations. When generals observed me remaining calm under pressure, they started developing their own practices for emotional regulation. When citizens witnessed me living simply despite imperial wealth, a few began examining their own relationship with material desires. I discovered that the most powerful teaching happened through what I called principled persistence, the quiet, consistent application of virtue over time, regardless of whether others noticed or approved. When I continued treating difficult senators with respect despite their opposition, some eventually responded with greater cooperation. When I maintained honest communication, even when truth was unwelcome, advisors gradually became more forthright. In their counsel, the mentor's stylus recorded my growing understanding that different people needed different approaches to discipline development. Some learned best through clear expectations and structured accountability. Others responded to gentle encouragement and patient support. Still others required the shock of natural consequences before they would consider changing their behavior. Learn to recognize the signs of readiness for discipline in others. Those who asked genuine questions about virtue rather than seeking to justify their current behavior. Those who expressed dissatisfaction with their own patterns rather than blaming external circumstances for their problems. Those who showed willingness to experiment with small changes rather than demanding guarantees before making any effort. For those who seemed ready, I developed what I called invitation without pressure, offering opportunities to practice discipline while making it clear that the choice was entirely theirs. I might suggest that a senator try examining his motivations before voting, or recommend that a general consider the long-term consequences of a proposed strategy. But I never demanded compliance or punished those who declined. The stylus helped me document the most important principle of teaching discipline. You cannot give someone else something you do not possess yourself. The leader who struggled with his own emotional regulation could not credibly teach others about managing anger. The emperor who lived in luxury while preaching about simple living would inspire cynicism rather than virtue. This realization led me to see every moment of my own disciplined living as a teaching opportunity, not in a performative way that sought to impress others, but in the authentic way that simply demonstrated what was possible when someone committed fully to virtue. My morning practices, my responses to crises, my treatment of enemies, my relationship with pleasure and pain, all of these became lessons available to anyone who chose to observe and learn. The most profound teaching occurred through what I called creating space for growth, establishing environments where virtue was rewarded, where honest mistakes were treated as learning opportunities, and where people felt safe to experiment with better ways of living. The emperor who punished every failure would train his subjects to hide their struggles rather than address them. The succession documents lay before me, each page carefully crafted to ensure the smooth transition of imperial power after my death. But as I reviewed these formal arrangements for Rome's future, I found myself contemplating a deeper question. What legacy would my disciplined living leave beyond the administrative details of governance? The papers would determine who would rule next, but my character would influence how that rule might unfold. I had always understood that emperors leave two kinds of legacies, the obvious one recorded in official histories, and the subtle one, embedded in the culture and consciousness of those they led. Buildings crumble, laws change, military victories fade into distant memory, but the example of a life lived with virtue continues to inspire, long after the person who lived it has returned to dust. As I prepared these final documents, I reflected on what I hoped my years of disciplined living had accomplished beyond the immediate successes and failures of my reign. Had I demonstrated that power could be wielded with virtue? Had I shown that philosophy was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a practical approach to leadership? Had I proved that strength and gentleness could coexist in the same person? The most important legacy of disciplined living, I realized, was not what I had achieved, but what I had become, and how that becoming had influenced others to examine their own potential for growth. Every senator who had witnessed my commitment to justice despite personal cost carried that example forward into his own decisions. Every general who had observed my emotional discipline under pressure had a model for maintaining composure in his own crises. I thought of the young officers who had served under me during the Germanic campaigns, watching how I handled fear, uncertainty, and moral complexity. Some would rise to positions of great responsibility themselves, and in their crucial moments of choice, they might remember seeing their emperor choose virtue over expedience and find the courage to do likewise. The succession papers reminded me that the ultimate test of disciplined living was not personal peace or individual achievement, but the creation of conditions for others to flourish. Had my daily practices of virtue made it easier for good people to succeed in the imperial system? Had my resistance to corruption created space for integrity to be rewarded? Had my commitment to justice encouraged others to speak truth to power? I understood that legacy was not primarily about being remembered, but about what continues to live and grow because of how we chose to live. The disciplines I had practiced, the principles I had embodied, the example I had set, these would ripple outward through time in ways I could never track or control. The most profound realization was that disciplined living creates what I could only call moral momentum, a force that makes virtue slightly easier for those who come after. When someone in authority consistently chooses character over convenience, it becomes more conceivable for others to make similar choices. When a leader demonstrates that principle can survive contact with pressure, it strengthens the faith of others in the possibility of ethical action. My private meditations, my morning disciplines, my careful responses to crisis practices that had seemed purely personal had actually been contributions to the moral resources available to future generations. Every time I had chosen virtue despite difficulty, I had added weight to the side of goodness in the ongoing human struggle between noble and ignoble impulses. The succession documents would ensure administrative continuity, but the legacy of disciplined living would offer something more valuable, proof that human beings can transcend their immediate impulses and circumstances to become worthy of the responsibilities they are given. As I signed the final papers that would transfer imperial power to my successor, I felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with having used my time on earth to make virtue slightly more possible for those who would come after me. Before me lies a blank wax tablet, its surface smooth and unmarked, waiting for the first words to be inscribed. This simple object represents the greatest gift I can offer you, the opportunity to begin writing your own story of disciplined living. Everything I have shared, the struggles, the practices, the insights gained through decades of imperial responsibility, becomes meaningful only when you take these principles and make them your own. You do not need to rule an empire to benefit from Stoic self-discipline. The same principles that helped me govern millions can help you govern your own life with greater wisdom, purpose, and effectiveness. The morning practices that prepared me for imperial decisions can prepare you for whatever challenges await. In your daily responsibilities, the emotional disciplines that kept me steady during crises can keep you centered during your own storms. Begin where I began, with honest self-examination. Look at your current patterns of behavior without judgment, but with clear eyes. Where do you consistently break promises to yourself? When do you choose comfort over growth, reaction over response, impulse over intention? These moments of weakness are not failures to be ashamed of, but opportunities to be seized for development. Start with the discipline of morning reflection. Rise 15 minutes earlier than usual and spend that time in quiet contemplation of the day ahead. Ask yourself, what kind of person do I want to be today? How can I serve something larger than my immediate comfort? What would virtue look like in my specific circumstances? This simple practice will begin building the inner foundation that all other disciplines require. Develop your own version of the artifacts that guided me. Choose a physical object, a stone, a coin, a simple ring that can remind you of your commitment to disciplined living. When you feel anger rising, reach for this token and remember that you have the power to choose your response. When faced with temptation, let it remind you of your deeper values. When overwhelmed by circumstances, use it to anchor yourself in what you can control. Practice the discipline of desire by regularly choosing simplicity over luxury, contentment over acquisition, gratitude over complaint. This does not mean living in deprivation, but rather finding satisfaction in what you already possess while remaining unattached to what you lack. Notice how often your unhappiness stems from wanting things to be different, rather than accepting what is while working thoughtfully toward what could be. Embrace the discipline of action by aligning your daily choices with your stated values. If you claim to value health, make decisions that support your physical well-being. If you profess to care about relationships, invest time and attention in the people who matter most. If you believe in justice, act justly, even when it costs you personally. The gap between your values and your actions is where character is built or eroded. Cultivate the discipline of assent by learning to separate facts from your interpretations of facts. When someone criticizes you, distinguish between their actual words and your assumptions about their motivations. When facing setbacks, separate what happened from your predictions about what it means for your future. This practice alone will eliminate much unnecessary suffering from your life. Remember that discipline is not about perfection, but about progress. You will fail, sometimes spectacularly. You will choose comfort over growth, react instead of respond. Let emotions drive decisions that reason should make. These failures are not evidence that you lack the capacity for discipline. They are the raw material from which discipline is built. Each mistake is feedback, each setback a chance to begin again with greater wisdom. The blank tablet waits for your first inscription. What will you write? How will you begin the practice of Stoics? Self-discipline in your unique circumstances? The path I have described is not my path, but the path available to anyone willing to choose growth over comfort, virtue over convenience, character over reputation. Your empire may be smaller than Rome, but it is no less real and no less deserving of wise, disciplined leadership. Begin today. Begin now. Begin with this moment and this choice. The tablet is blank, the stylus is in your hand, and the rest of your life is waiting to be written with intention, wisdom, and virtue.